Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Today I continue our series of videos and lectures on the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, and this one is devoted to the collapse of the White regime, or to answer a simple question, why did the Whites lose? Now, in the preceding videos, I talked about the successful offensive of General Denikin in the south to Moscow, towards Moscow, Denikin's march on Moscow, and we stopped at the crucial moment of October 1919 when Denikin's forces were within 200 kilometers from Moscow in the city of Oryol. Everything looked perfectly well. He actually had an interview with a British correspondent who was he was sent to cover the triumphal entry of Denikin into Moscow. But this was not going to happen. And so what we're going to talk about today is why did the regime collapse, and collapse so precipitously, so quickly. Within 3 months, it was all over. By December, the White armies were defeated, and in March, the last ships evacuating the numerous Russian refugees left Russia for the West forever. So what happened? What were the causes? Obviously, one could always think of causes when it happened, but there were several indications in the preceding videos about the nature of the White regime, what was actually happening that led to this precipitous demise. So this is, I will try to discuss this in terms of specific reasons. And the first number of reasons would be obviously the military ones. And then we'll go over to the political ones and the most important ones, the internal dynamic of the White regime. So the military reasons, number one. The rule of the Civil War is that it goes very quickly when the sympathies of the population are with the advancing army. And this is exactly what was happening because the Whites were going into the areas, as I showed in the preceding videos, afflicted by wide-scale anti-Bolshevik rebellion. So this propelled them even further. But within that context, there was also a perilous reality, and that is, the further the Whites' armies advanced, the more difficult their advance became simply because the front line became larger. So 150,000 army, and then there were more recruits. They had to defend a much bigger territory. So by October, it was a huge territory that spanned from the western Ukraine in contact with the Polish army, all the way to central Russia to Oryol, and then further down to Black Earth region to Tsaritsyn on the Volga. And then all the ships came to Novorossiysk or Sevastopol, and all this ammunition and all the supplies and everything for the army had to be shipped as huge distances, larger than France, to the front line. So the bigger the offensive, the bigger the front line to defend. Now, the second reason, of course, was numerical. The Bolsheviks had a numerical advantage, but the Whites knew that all along, and that never stopped them, and they were really quite convinced that they would continue to be winning against the Bolsheviks. And I want to say that despite the fact that the Bolsheviks had almost doubled the army size, the Red Army, it was not a decisive factor in the defeat of the Whites. Moreover, it was not the thesis that the Bolsheviks had support of the population, and that's why they won the Civil War, is also absolutely not true, and I will try to show it. It was not the social support, and it was not the strength of the Red Army that broke the back of the White Army and the White regime. It was the internal, domestic situation. As the German historians say, primacy of domestic politics is the answer. Primat der Innenpolitik. So, the Bolsheviks had about 300,000, but they were totally afflicted by desertion, and I will show it in other videos. There were like 90,000 deserters in each and one of those central Russian provinces. So the Bolsheviks were in pretty bad shape, and it was not the strength of the Red Army that managed to win. Nevertheless, it is a factor. Number three, no prepared positions for retreat. gain or lose approach. This we discussed earlier, and this is of course one of the key military reasons for the defeat, is that Denikin had a choice. Either you advance slowly and build up defensive positions in case there's a reversal of fortunes, and then that strategy would have required to stop in the fall and build up defensive positions and then continue the advance the next year. That's something that was done later in the Spanish Civil War, when Franco tried to advance in Madrid and Barcelona. Now, Denikin decided to go va-banque, as to say, so to go all the way and had it all done before winter. And that means there were no defensive positions, for which he was criticized later by General Wrangel, who took over the command. Now, the reason number 4, and that is probably the most important one, is the condition of the white administration and the condition of the white regime. As I mentioned before, only a small number of the white officers of the volunteer army were these dedicated, heroic martyrs who were willing to sacrifice their life and fight to the death with this cult of death and heroism and Mother Russia commitment. A lot of them were kind of carry on from the old regime. They were careerists and bureaucrats. And I'll give you a quote by Prince Obolensky, who was a supporter of the white regime and an advisor of some sort to Denikin himself. And this is what he wrote. In the localities with sole power, in power, bureaucrats, careerists, malicious, cruel, vengeful restorationists who settled accounts with their political opponents. These were speculators and crooks who strove to use their power to enrich themselves. In other words, the gangs of Chekai, murderers and rapists that the Bolsheviks were replaced by old-time czarist officials and bureaucrats who basically used their power to enrich themselves. The corruption was pretty bad in the white-controlled territories. Here's another opinion of very respected former Marxist Peter Struve, who was an advisor to Denikin, so he obviously sympathized with Denikin. And he wrote, many took advantage of the chaotic situation of the Civil War to enrich themselves. Corruption was pervasive. And another quote by Dmitry Lechovich, who was a biographer of Denikin, a sympathetic one, and who tried to reconstruct major reasons for the success and failure of the Denikin movement. And this is what he wrote. Illegally acquired merchandise, foodstuffs, salt, canned food, liquor, clothing, linen, uniforms from Great Britain. All of these were sold and resold on the black markets in Novorossiysk. So that shows that the degree to which the administration under the whites was anything but an example of honesty, dedication, and commitment. And in that sense, it was a big weak spot of the white regime. Transformation of the whites from the heroes and martyrs of the 1918 to the robbers and pogromshiks, people who settled accounts with the Jews and socialists, driven by hatred, who were eager to punish the Reds, and who replaced law and order by arbitrary rule, by irresponsible, unaccountable regime. This is what slowly was happening to the heroes of 1918 of Kornilov. Here's a quote from Mai-Maevsky, who was a general in the general staff of General Denikin, one of the key leaders of the white regime, who cannot be reproached of saying untruth about his own army. This is what he wrote. He wrote it to Denikin. There is robbery on grand scale of government property captured by the Bolsheviks and of peaceful population perpetrated by individual army men, bands and units with the connivance of their commanders. Now, this comes from a general in the general staff of General Denikin, and that means it is probably true, which means, of course, that there's no law and order. There's settlement of account, there's corruption, there is a living off the population, and of course, something I discussed in the previous video, wide-scale pogroms against the Jews. So the political regime is, the quality of that regime is one of the major reasons of the collapse. But there's even more important one, and perhaps the most important one, and that is the relationship with the Cossacks. Now, as you may have seen in the previous videos, one of the greatest breakthroughs that the volunteer army managed to score in June 1919 was because of the rebellion of the Cossacks against the Bolsheviks. When they joined forces together, they become invincible, and they proceed to incredible victories in the June, July, August, September 1919. So the alliance of Cossacks with the Whites is absolutely crucial for the outcome of civil war. But what we shall see now is that this alliance cracked, and then it actually fell through. And that is one of the major reasons for the defeat of the White Army. So, why was it such a tense relationship? Well, simply because they had different political goals. The only thing in common between the Whites and the Cossacks is their mutual hatred of the Bolsheviks, but for different reasons. The Whites wanted to have Russia united and indivisible. Some of them are monarchists, but they obviously wanted to establish a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, and they hated all the socialists. Now, the Cossacks were not interested in Russia united and indivisible. They didn't mind that it would be Russia indivisible, but they really wanted to do is to safeguard their own territory and to safeguard their own institutions of self-rule, which was a Cossack Rada in Kuban and Cossack Circle Assembly in the Don. And these were very valuable because these were the ones that go back to their traditions, to the centuries of their self-rule granted by Catherine II. They wanted to preserve those. Now, if we look at the politics of the Cossack Assembly and the Kuban Rada, they were run by socialists. They were socialist revolutionaries. And it was one of the key events was the murder of the chairman of the Kuban Rada, Mr. Ryabovol. Who actually was a socialist and a socialist revolutionary, and in his speeches in the Rada, he claimed more and more to preserve the independence and self-rule of these assemblies. And I'll read you a quote from Mr. Agayev, who was a member of the Kuban Rada, which is a local parliament, explaining this growing rift between the Cossacks and the Whites. In a letter, he said, "It is a fact that the Cossacks already for 2 years have carried out a hard struggle against the traitors to the motherland, with the most worst enemies of the laboring Russian people, the communists, commissars, people's commissars, councils on economy, revolutionary committees, Chekas, and other creatures and wolves of Soviet paradise." The letter argued that the Cossacks had proven their dedication to the cause of saving Russia from Bolshevik despotism and expressed indignation at the labels pinned on them by the Cossacks. And I quote, Agayev wrote, "Instead of overthrowing dictatorship of the proletariat, you try to establish some other kind of dictatorship. We will not submit to it, because we have risen in revolt against one dictatorship in the name of freedom for us and for the whole people, and not for the sake of another dictatorship. We have struggled against the violence of the Bolsheviks for the sake of freedom of the motherlands, and the Constituent Assembly, freely elected by all citizens, we consider to be the only symbol of our freedom." So that shows, of course, socialist revolutionary language and sympathies of the Agayev letter, and that rift is one of the major reasons for the collapse of the White regime. The murder of Rabovol basically disheartened the Cossack units, and when the front cracked and the whites began to retreat, we have evidence that the Cossacks simply did not fight. They abandoned positions, went back to their stanitsas, to their homeland, and their spirit was broken, and they were not willing to fight for the White Army anymore, and that is one of the major reasons for the collapse. And now we come to the catastrophe, which is November 1919. It was a rout that couldn't be stopped. One position after another, one city after another. It was a chaos retreat that was a great catastrophe for millions of Russian people and for those who were exposed to the Bolshevik uh, invasion. I will read to you very briefly the letter to Denikin by General Wrangel, who replaced him as a commander-in-chief. At the very time when the volunteer armies were victoriously advancing on Moscow, and your ears were listening to the sounds and bells of Moscow, in the hearts of many of your subordinate commanders, alarm crept in. These armies, without training, and subsisting on robbery, afflicted with drunkenness, in which the chiefs led, the disorganized of the example were the armies not to save Russia. Without an organized rear, without one prepared position, a chain of communication, retreating through the places where the population learned to hate them, the volunteer army, once the retreat began, was forced to move precipitously. And I will stop at this, and I'd like to invite you to subscribe and watch the next video about the evacuation and the total collapse of the white regime. And you can see all of the information here in my book, Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War. Thank you, and please subscribe once again. Bye.